Lingua Brutalica is a podcast that uses ethnographic interviews to study language use in the extreme metal community. We are studying a music scene known for its love of themes and topics generally considered offensive, and it is likely that some episodes will touch on topics or opinions some listeners may find tasteless or ethically problematic. Ethnographic researchers aim to adopt the interviewee's point of view so that we can draw out and study the attitudes, beliefs, and practices that are important to them. We want to make it clear that in presenting these conversations here, we do not endorse any of their content. Our aim is to explore the thought processes behind language use in this long-running, international, and yet understudied scene.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Lingua Brutalica with me, Jess Crook, and my co-host Wes Robertson.
Hello.
In our episode today, we have Louis Thierry of Parius. Welcome back to the podcast, Louis.
Hey there, guys. Thank you very much for having me today.
So just to kick things off, how would you describe Parius's music to someone that's never heard it before? What kind of genre of metal would you say it falls under?
So that's a good question. So I know, obviously, I think we're a band that tries pretty hard to do something new each time. I would say our current iteration is fairly squarely in the progressive metal genre, but for the first release was probably more like melodic death metal, and then some of the releases in between I would characterize a little bit more as progressive death metal. So unfortunately, we're a bit of a form shifting beast here and there. So, but yeah, progressive metal for the time being.
Okay. Because you're the first band I think we've talked to where Encyclopedia Metallum gave you two categories: progressive melodic death metal early / progressive metal / rock later. Does that jive with you, or do you consider yourself rock?
I mean, I wouldn't, but I guess there's arguments to be made for some progressive metal leaning a bit more into the rock side of things. I think it just gets a little complicated when you don't do as much screaming. Mm-hmm. Or harsh vocals. You might start to adopt that for people that maybe, again, and I don't want to be a genre snob or anything like that, but I guess it's par for the course for sort of changing your sound every couple of albums. But yeah.
So when did you start first getting into metal music, and what attracted you to the style? Did you start with progressive death metal?
No, so definitely not. I'm never sure if this is odd for people or not, but I really didn't start listening to music till I was about 13. If my dad weren't playing something on his speakers in the living room or something like that, I was not listening to music on my own. Mm-hmm. But a lot of that was, Beatles, Deep Purple, Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, things like that. So that would have been my first entrance to independently listening to music. And then I pretty quickly got into what I probably wouldn't consider to be metal today, but things like sort of like, I don't want to say emo music, but things like Escape the Fate, Bullet for My Valentine, Bring Me the Horizon. That was sort of my trajectory initially. And that sort of gave way, like Metallica, stuff like that. And then that gave way to maybe a lot heavier metal, things like Flesh God Apocalypse was probably one of the first like really heavy bands I ever genuinely enjoyed. And then from there, it's, sort of all over the place. And then I'm one of those metalheads that probably at one point when I don't even really, I'm not really interested in listening to metal a lot anymore. So I definitely started to dabble with a lot of, other styles of music. And now it's, here and there, obviously still listening to a lot of metal, but not opposed to listening to things that aren't metal either. So, yep.
So what kind of drew you to those heavier genres to begin with then? Why get into that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I guess initially, it's a bit at the edge, you want something that, you know, scares your parents a little bit. You know, they especially things like Escape the Fate and Bring Me the Horizon and stuff like that had a very distinct look about them, which I think initially, you know, when you're younger, trying to find yourself, you sort of latch onto something and you go like, ooh, I like the way they look. And then you get caught up in the whole style of it. So that was definitely, and I guess again, my dad listened to what would have been the metal of his day. You know what I mean? Like Rolling Stones at one point was the peak of, you know, counterculture-y, let me piss my parents off kind of music. So I think sort of just following in those footsteps, but the flavor of today is, you know, metal, heavy metal, death metal, stuff like that. But yeah.
So were you kind of entirely focused on sort of image and sound at that time, or did you pay any attention to the lyrics of any of the bands you were listening to?
So my journey with how much I care about lyrics in metal definitely has gone up and down. I would say when I was 15 or, you know, thereabouts, because again, that's roughly the age when I was starting to really get into music. I would probably say at that point in my life, I cared a lot. You know, I wanted each song that I listened to have some meaning behind it or something like that. I've softened that stance a lot these days. These days, I don't particularly, this is going to be, you know, contrarian maybe, but I don't particularly care about the lyrics for most songs. I think I don't want to not like music because I don't enjoy the lyrics. So I tend to try to not block them out, but let's just say, you know, I would consider Dream Theater to be one of my favorite bands, and I would not consider their lyricism to be top notch or anything like that. So you sort of have to, or at least I sort of have to push some of that down. Whereas a band that I do really like the lyrics of, or at least their most recent release, Palimpsest in Protest the Hero, you know, I think there's something really interesting he's doing with the lyrical topics and themes that he's decided to write about. Whereas I don't want to have to discredit, or not discredit, I don't want to have to disavow bands for not having good lyrics, if that makes sense. So it's definitely been a bit of a up and down sort of relationship.
Have you ever had to do that? Like, you know, has there ever been like a case where like you weren't able to just like ignore the lyrics and it actually ruined it for you?
Yeah. I don't know. I was toying about whether or not I wanted to say what the band was, but I think they were called Within the Ruins, and I can't remember what album it was. And I did really like the album, but after a couple of listens to it, there were just some things he would say or some lyrics that I would sit there and go, wow, this is making it hard to listen to. So I'd like to find bands with lyrics that are like inoffensive, and I don't mean that in a sort of not inoffensive as in like offending to me, but just don't be so bad that you're taking away from the music that's being played. And that's definitely something that I you know, aspire to with some of my music as well.
So are you kind of saying
not often, but sometimes?
So would you be saying then that like awfulness of content is harder to ignore than awfulness of style?
No. So it's like, you know, I can't say that I would particularly enjoy a metal song about dismembering a body or something like that, but that is less offensive to me than just poorly worded, very, very basic, trying to think of the word, very basic language maybe. And I'm not saying that I need all my songs I listen to have, you know, a lyricist to be having a thesaurus next to them, finding the most perfect word each time, but you know, really basic rhyming schemes like, you know, Black Attack, stuff like that. You're just like, come on, man, you can do a little bit more. So I would say that's more what kind of makes it hard for me to enjoy the lyrics in music sometimes.
Conversely, what makes good metal lyrics? If we can define metal lyrics as like a thing that has, some kind of border.
Sure. So, it's hard to say, but at least for me, I'll go back to, just because it's an album I revisit a lot and something I think is very, very interesting lyrically. But so like Palimpsest by Protest the Hero has a very interesting theme in its sort of centering around early America. Maybe not that early, maybe like feels to me like between 1850 and maybe 1910 America, which to me on a metal album, that is not a widely explored concept.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm a sci-fi guy, so if you're singing about blowing up spaceships, I'm gonna lean towards that as something like, base level, fine, that's good to listen to. But I wouldn't say, I guess maybe that's part of maybe why as a band we change genres every now and then, because the scope of metal can sometimes be limiting in what you want to talk about. So it's hard to have maybe a heartfelt collection of words when the expectation is that you're screaming all the lyrics over
Mm-hmm.
this heavy riff or this heavy breakdown. You can't there's only so many emotions you can express at full throttle. So that's sort of why we softened our sound, at least for this record, because I think we wanted to convey more emotions. And I guess that's sort of what I'm getting at, is that you can't, I wouldn't, the classic, Metallica style lyrics or some of that old school death metal where it's just talking about gore. So it's hard to pin down what makes metal lyrics metal, but at the same time, it's, usually more aggressive, dark in nature, stuff like that. Did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. Actually, like we've talked to a few people in the prep this year that actually were saying that, oh no, you can sing about anything in metal. And of course, we ask, well, why don't people? But do you feel that there are some topics that just don't really match metal very well? Like, could you, we have had people argue that you could have love songs or songs about cute things in a screaming metal track that's not meant to be a joke, but maybe you feel there's a bit of what's the word, like binding or a bit of pressure to conform?
So yeah, I would say definitely, for sure. There's definitely some pressure to not sing about stuff, because I'd say half of what brings people to metal is that they're, maybe singing about their feelings, but not in love songs or things like I don't necessarily want to listen to a love song. I want to listen to preferably a story being told, but I think metal lends itself to maybe more of my interests, let's just random things like action movies, sci-fi, horror, things of that nature, which I just find more interesting on my own. I would not say that you can't have a love song with screamed lyrics or anything like that, but let's just say if there were a love song on the Eldritch realm, for argument's sake, it might fall a little flat if it's being belted out with harsh vocals the entire time. So I'd say maybe that's what draws people to metal in general, is that there's not a super defined boundary of what you can and can't do. So sky's the limit, but within reason, in my opinion. You want to match. One thing I try to do with my lyrics is that I want to match tonally what is going on in the song. And I feel like I personally tried very hard to match what I was saying on the newest album, the Signal Heard Throughout Space. I wanted to match what I was saying to the tone of the song at the time. So that was something I was very conscious of while writing my lyrics there.
And has that always been your approach, or has your approach to writing lyrics kind of changed over time?
Yeah, for sure. So the first album, I'm 28 now, but the first album, Saturnine, the lyrics for that were probably written between the ages of 15 and 17 or something to that effect. So I don't even know what I was thinking at that point, honestly. But there wasn't a lot, for sure. There was not a whole lot knocking around up there when I was that young. So, I always gravitated towards the lead singer of a band, the vocals, lyrics, stuff like that when I was younger, for sure. But when you're 15, you don't have a lot of interesting stuff to say. So as time went on, I would definitely, when you're younger, it's a lot of, you're just sort of emulating what you like. So when I was younger, I would say that one of my favorite bands and vocalists and lyricists was in a band called Woe of Tyrants. And he has a way of writing lyrics that I found incredibly compelling. In the second album, there's a lot of biblical references and stuff like that, which I found really cool when I was younger. I still think it's cool, but when I was 15, I thought it was really cool. So yeah, I'm sort of getting tangential here, so hopefully that was answering the question.
Yeah, for sure. I suppose, kind of following on from that, we wanted to talk a little bit about your kind of relationship to your lyrics, just because, on a general sense, before we dive into the nitty-gritty, because as we have spoken about extensively on this podcast at this point, a lot of research has kind of suggested that a lot of metal lyricists tend to take a kind of position of distance from the lyrics that they write and the stories that they write about, kind of framing them as kind of pure entertainment that doesn't necessarily have any kind of connection to their own kind of personal identities or points of view. So given your last few albums have specifically been kind of more conceptual in nature, in that they tell stories, we were curious on whether or not this take is something that resonates with you.
So I would say definitely. So these days, I tend not to like music that is attempting to make super profound sort of points or statements and stuff like that, because it's just not what I'm into. I would say that specifically with the Eldritch Realm and the Signal Heard Throughout Space, I'm certainly not saying anything profound, but I am using what I like as a framing device to maybe talk about what I want to. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm definitely more in the camp of I like to hear stories. They don't need some sort of profound underlying resonance to connect with me. But so for argument's sake, I think I wrote the Eldritch Realm and the Signal to not be both, but let's just say it means something to me. But it's mostly dressed up as like a story. And that's more the case with the Signal, where I was sort of using a story as a backdrop to express myself, but that's not, it's not making some sort of greater statement on society or anything like that. It's just sort of how I was feeling and how I decided to express myself through the concept of the record.
Stories are always about something, though, right? To some extent.
Sure. So I actually distinctly, now that you say that, I distinctly remember in high school, there's a book called The Once and Future King, which I never read. But when I heard that kids were reading a story about King Arthur in high school, I was like, I want to get into that class because that's the kind of stuff I want to read. And then I heard that it was, all an analogy or an allegory for something. I can't remember what it was at this point, but that upset me at the time. It wouldn't upset me now, but it upset me at the time because it's escapism, right? You want to escape into the world of King Arthur and his knights and stuff like that. And I don't want it to reflect real life at the time. That's how I felt. So yeah, so exactly to your point, there's always something in a story that has meaning. I guess for me, I prefer it when it's maybe something personal to the lyricist or vocalist of the band, and not trying to make a statement personally. Nothing wrong with that if one were to. However, it's just not my speed.
Are some songs then just more grounded in the real world than others, though? Like, is there kind of like a bit of variation to the degree to which they are kind of a source of escapism versus a kind of reflection, albeit an abstract reflection on reality? Like, I mean, we were thinking about the song Mannequin Soldiers from your first release, a bit of a kind of critique of war as it refers to the manufacture of soulless warriors by an uncaring father, but Galactic Termination, which discusses running from a planet destroying a creature named Chab Ragnagar, seems more abstract then.
Sure.
So, is that generally the case for you? Do they have to be some kind of like link to reality at all? And do you tend to kind of like play around with like the degree to which, there are kind of links to the real world or abstractions from the real world?
So it's a good question. Unfortunately, with that first album, Saturnine, that, as I may have mentioned earlier, there's not a whole lot knocking around in a 15-year-old's head. So anything that resembles something that might be making a statement back then was, unfortunately, cat out of the bag. I pretty much only knew how to write songs about media I was interested in.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, Mannequin Soldier was about an anime called Full Metal Alchemist. So the Mannequin Soldier was some plot point later on in the series. So unfortunately, any reflection to real life is unfortunately not the case. And the Shamragnagar, you got it better than me that time. So that, I think, that song as well as Dr. Device are about Ender's Game, as you nailed in the questionnaire there.
Is that creature in Ender's Game? I googled the heck out of it.
No, so he's actually, if I can remember correctly, which I may not be, I believe there's like a general in the book called like Shamgar or Shamragnar or something like that, and I was like, wow, I like the way that sounds. Let me sauce it up a little bit and turn it into some monster or something like that. So yeah, a lot of those songs on Saturnine are just referential to media I was into. Saturnine itself being a concept in the video game BioShock, stuff like that. You know what I mean? So, but these days, I very much don't want the things that I write to reflect reality. And it's not that the emotions that I'm trying to convey with my song can't be real, but I want, as I mentioned earlier, when I listen to something, I want it to take me somewhere else. So that's sort of what I shoot for in my lyrics as well.
So, I mean, you mentioned all these series, and there's also a song that you have that is set around like Avatar: The Last Airbender. When you were writing all this,
was there any chagrin there? Yeah.
Okay, well, that's I wanted to ask, like, was there any pushback?
I got a lot of shit for that.
Okay, you did?
Well, my goal when I was writing lyrics for stuff like that is to, and obviously I didn't do it that well sometimes, but what the goal was to obfuscate what I was talking about enough so that my guitarist Ryan couldn't Google it and figure out immediately what it was. So obviously that's not the case with some of that stuff, but if I can remember correctly, I would say things like the song Saturnine, I felt like I did a good job of singing about a concept I was interested in the video game BioShock without it being immediately recognizable as that. Things with Dr. Device and Galactic Termination, less less subtlety there, or what a 15-year-old thinks is subtle. Did that answer your question?
Well, yeah, because I was curious if people were telling you you can't have anime in, like, you can't write a metal song about anime. Was that, did you get that response from your guitarist?
I think at the time, it's just, I don't want to sound like a hater, but it's just kind of lame. You know what I mean? So today, if I listen to a song that was clearly about an anime, or, well, that's not, I mean, I did really like the Star One album, Revel in Time, recently, and that's all about movies and stuff. I guess if it's the theme of the album, I could forgive it more. But there is an album by a band called Veil of Maya that I think is called Matriarch or something, and I think every song name is a different woman from an anime series, and I'm like not into that at all. I think that's I would never do that today. I prefer to synthesize things that I'm interested in and sort of make something original out of it. At the time, I didn't have anything original to say, so I lent. And I'm not saying that anyone who does that is unoriginal or something like that. I'm just saying at the time, that's how I felt and how I feel about it now, where I want to make something of my own, if that makes sense. So.
One thing that's consistent, though, across your releases is even on the first album, you are kind of positioning all these songs as though you are a storyteller. What kind of inspired you to take that approach of like telling a tale in a metal song as the way that you are going to, sing songs in Parius? It's because the way you do it is different, but you're still telling stories up until the most recent record.
For sure. So I think that's just always what's connected with me the most. I like things to have a beginning, middle, and end. I want something that I can feel like I can sink my teeth into and understand. If a song had lyrics that is sort of a jumbled attempt at conveying an emotion, or maybe overly poetic, and again, this is just my opinion, overly poetic, I sort of tend to lose the plot. No pun intended, but it's that I just find it more interesting, really. I just, especially evidently on the last two albums. Mm-hmm. If your album is tied together conceptually, I don't care how stupid it is. I don't care if I don't like it. The idea that song 6 tells this point of a story helps me be interested in the music from front to back. So for argument's sake, there's definitely a time where I sort of fell out of love with super heavy metal when we were going in I think the band, so Kenny Wrench, the bassist, has always been into the less extreme side of metal. And I think at some point, I don't want to speak necessarily for them, but at some point we all were sort of listening to similar progressive styled music that was less on the heavy side. Mm-hmm. And I've recently, quote unquote, recently gotten a little bit back into the heavier stuff. But when you are listening to a 60-minute all-out assault on your eardrums, I tend to get tired of it. But as I mentioned, if there's plot points to look forward to in the music, I find that for me, it can carry an album. If you have a concept and your album's bad, I'm not going to like it, but it's better than not having one. How about that?
So does that mean you still look up lyrics? Because some of it, if it's all screaming, you don't know if there's a plot point until you check, right? Is checking lyrics still something you find yourself doing a lot?
No. And that's maybe the ironic thing is that our bassist Kenny gives me a lot of shit for is that I will not look up lyrics. I will get the lyrics wrong, and I don't care if I am singing the wrong thing, because what I hear is what I like better. So yeah, sometimes I will. Again, I think if an album really connects with me, I'll take the time to read the lyrics. And I don't necessarily, unfortunately, I'm not someone that needs to sort of understand the concept inside and out to enjoy something. As long as I think there's something there, that's good enough for me. So for argument's sake, there's a band that I recently heard about through because some people compared them, roughly to us in some reviews, was a band called Luna's Call. And they have an album called Void. And I got very, very into that album for a couple of months. And I don't know if there's a story. I've never listened to the lyrics all the way through, but I think there's one there. So it's sort of, it helps me fall in love with an album, let's say, but I don't necessarily need to understand it to fully appreciate it. That being said, not to get on too much of a soapbox here, but there was an album that I found out about a couple of years ago, but I think is a little bit older than that, and it's called Pink Lemonade by a band called A Closure in Moscow. And that, in my opinion, was, again, the story's pretty wacky, but they do a good job of making it feel like you're going on an adventure when you listen to it, and I think that's something I really am into. One of my other favorite bands being Ayreon. They a band really famous for their rock operas and sprawling concepts and stuff like that. So those albums, Ayreon and Closure in Moscow, I would say were very large influences on what I wanted to do with my voice and my story, in the sense that they're both sort of bands that tend to be like wackier sci-fi styled stuff. But yeah, hopefully that answered the question there.
Yeah, for sure.
Totally. It's interesting you say that, because I suppose thinking about it now, there are quite a lot of bands that do tend to try to kind of detail or recreate these quite expansive worlds in the context of their lyrics, and do kind of like to tell quite like epic scale tales, across like a single or multiple albums. Do you think there's anything about metal in particular as a genre that kind of facilitates this? Do you think there's something especially metal about epic tales like that?
I would say definitely, because it's hard. I would say that it's hard to tell a sprawling epic tale through the lens of, I don't know, 90s hip hop, right? I'm not saying it can't be done, but there's, inherently the grandiose nature of metal lends itself to telling silly, grandiose stories. You know what I mean? In the same way that rock music, you want to hear some guy with like a manly, raspy voice talking about like smoking cigarettes and dating women. You know what I mean? So definitely, I think music definitely tends to lend itself to certain. So I'm just rearranging myself in the seat there. Lends itself to certain styles. Again, I'm not saying it's necessarily constricting, but all genres to some degree have their sort of boilerplate topics that they'll tend to orbit around. But so the grandiose nature of metal lends itself to these sort of larger than life stories, I would say.
So before we move out of kind of the earlier days of your career, just one quick question, last one, is that the only use of like a heavy swear word on any of your albums is on your first album, which is there's one use of fuck in the line, something is mine, just went and fucking snapped. You haven't sworn at all since then, except on the new album, there's goddamn in the line, it's been a goddamn ride, which again is a lot, lighter. Has your feeling about included swearing in your lyrics changed over time, or was this something you always kind of avoided and there's just two that kind of snuck in?
So to answer your question in not necessarily the order you asked it in,
okay.
I can't remember how I thought when I was 15, but I think the lyrics potentially speak for themselves. But I'm a huge proponent of not swearing in music. That doesn't mean I don't listen to music that swears or anything like that. And if I weren't on this podcast, I'd probably be swearing a lot more than I am right now. But so not to say that I don't swear in my daily life or anything like that. I'm not against swearing.
You are allowed to swear in the podcast, though. That is
Yeah,
okay.
just
I
so
know.
you
Yeah,
know.
I'm just messing around, trying to keep it like professional. You know what I mean?
Okay, yeah.
Because once I start, it's hard to stop.
Oh, okay.
And it's not super pleasant to hear the F word every 3 words. So, yeah, I'm a big proponent of not swearing in music, just because my own personal view of it is that there's so many words to use in the English language. Why are you filling up all these words with some filler word essentially? And I think it helps me personally in our music, because let's just say for this newest album, it would sound kind of weird swearing when you sing, and the genre and style of music where, there's not a lot of edge to it, right? You're not, you probably want to swear if you have this cool rock song where you're, riding a motorcycle or something like that. So I guess what I would say there is that the only song I would have sworn in might have been Contact, because it's sort of got that snarly edge to it. But I like going forward, I would never swear. Well, okay. And here's the distinction. So I would never say fuck in a song probably ever again, just because I think it's lame. It's not, again, this is what I think. I'm not saying that anyone does it is lame, just how I feel about it. I think there's a lot of ways to say things more intelligently than throwing a swear in there. We don't have the sort of music that lends itself to just, saying fuck in the middle of a breakdown or something like that. So the goddamn in the end of the signal, to me, that almost doesn't seem like a swear, but that was meant to be sort of like maybe tongue in cheek's not the right word, but you hear like, man, it's been a goddamn ride kind of thing. So that was sort of what I was going for there, less of like the inherent swear. And then I think the one fuck that I've said in a song, I think again, my guitarist was like, man, you got to say the F word more. Saying the F word's cool in songs. I'm like, I don't know. I disagree. Sorry. So I snuck that in there for him. But yeah, that's kind of my overall feeling, is that there's a lot of words to use, and you can tell a story without saying it once. So
you did mention earlier, though, like matching the lyrical content to the feel of the music. Is death metal, extreme metal not a feel of music that kind of lends itself to fuck?
For sure. Yeah, again, I'm definitely not knocking anyone that does do it. I just when I'm writing my lyrics and telling a story, I don't want it like punctuated by swears and stuff, because I just think there's so much more stuff I can be doing with what the finite amount of words I have on an album. I want them to matter and count. Not, again, prefacing with saying that's, I'm not saying that anyone that swears in music is wrong for it. It's just how I feel about it.
Yeah, no. This is we're asking your opinion, not putting down laws, right?
No way.
Yeah, just gotta make sure I preface every potentially controversial statement with just how I feel about it. Yeah.
But what about swearing in Fear or something, like on the middle album? It has the guy kind of going through the horrific, Lovecraftian story.
Is there
not a opportunity for no shit somewhere in there, or is that also?
For sure. I could think. And again, it's just preference. I think it would be valid if a different person came in before or after me on, like, just as, let's say, the Eldritch realm, all the music was written. Someone decides to rewrite the lyrics and swears a couple more times. There's definitely places on the album where it might sound cool or something like that. It's just not my preference. For argument's sake, there's a band that we knew growing up, or I knew, like, we all knew a couple of them from one way or another, called Illustrium, and their vocalist, Jerry Martin. I can't say this definitively, but I think he also is very light on the swear words, if any, in a lot of his music. And I don't think I've ever actually talked to him about it, but I'd like to think that he was of a similar mindset, and that there's just like more important things I could be saying at the time. And I don't tend to sing about edgier topic, and I don't mean any edgy in a negative connotation, just sort of like, you know, if you were, I don't know where I'm going with that, but basically, yeah, it's just not my thing at the end of the day.
Well, moving on to your second release, the Eldritch Realm, we noticed this release does kind of stand out from your first album and the EP that came after in telling a story that runs across the length of the full album. So focused around the, of course, horrific adventures of the narrator and a woman named Lilith. So what motivated you to approach this format?
So yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I at some point, I can't remember exactly when it was, but at some point I decided that like concept albums are just peak music, generally speaking. So as I said, if there's a concept there and I like it more. If I don't like it and there's a concept, you did something right, kind of thing. You know what I mean? So that was definitely around the time where I was like, okay, cat out of the bag. It also makes writing lyrics a lot easier when I don't have to think of 9 independent concepts to think about or to write lyrics about. You know, there's a connecting thread to everything. I can think of what we're doing next or what's happening next that can help me write lyrics to go along with that. Whereas I think if I had to come up with 9 original concepts for each song, it'd do my head in, because that's a lot of different stuff to write lyrics about. But that was definitely the moment in time where I definitively decided that concept albums are superior. So, and then I wanted to reflect that in my own music.
I'm actually kind of surprised, because I thought it'd be harder to write a concept album. Because, like, you know, what if you write a story and you don't have enough tracks for it, or like you actually found it easier to write within the constraint?
Big time, yeah, because it's like, so you bring up a good point there when you say like track list constraint. So that was part of the issue with, in my opinion, the Eldritch Realm. And when I say issue, my issue with it is that I knew at that point that I wanted to write a concept album, but the 6 or so songs that I had to work with makes it hard. You know, the Eldritch Realm is 30 minutes and the Signal is 60 minutes. So and even in the Signal, I almost felt like I was running out of time and space to write a story. So I definitely struggled with that in the Eldritch Realm, and I think that's why. So one thing I was thinking about when, you know, leading up to this interview is that the way I feel about concepts is that I think you need to make sure that the story is not super complicated to the point where no one could understand what's happening until they read the lyric sheet, and even then some of them are still scratching their head after. And I'm not saying I nailed that in either of my attempts at a concept album, but that's just how I feel about it. So then the Eldritch Realm, I think the story is fairly nebulous in that it's not necessarily point A, point B, point C, point D. There might be some like logical leaps in where the story happens next, for argument's sake. I tried to minimize that in the Signal since I had more time and I had more things that I wanted to talk about. But so one thing that I get flack for from some of the bands sometimes is that I tend to repeat myself a lot. Let's just say concepts like, I don't know, the chimes from the Eldritch Realm, or obviously the Signal, but there's something I repeat a lot about the Gleam in the Signal, or I don't know, you know, sort of just take those 2 examples. So I use that as a way to sort of ground where we are in the story, because I don't want someone to listen to the 3rd track and be like, all right, I have no idea where we are now. So I tend to think that you need to find maybe between like 3 and 5 core concepts that your story sort of orbits around, and make sure that they continue to make sense in the context of the story as it goes through, so that there's something to be like, okay, yeah, here's the signal in the second song. Okay, his spaceship, something's not good with his spaceship on the third song. He finds what the gleam is in the fifth song or something like that. So I contrast that with some other progressive metal concept albums that I enjoy, where the story is so incomprehensibly complicated that, like I said, you might read the lyrics and still be like, okay, well, I still don't know what's going on here. So if there's not a blurb on Wikipedia summarizing it, I'm just like, all right. So that's kind of how I feel about that.
Well, so one thing that kind of goes across the album is there's a lot of references to Greek gods and myths outside of the general Lovecraftian theme, including Charon and the sea monsters Scylla and Charybdis. Pronunciation
Scylla and Charybdis.
Scylla and Charybdis, thank you.
Yep.
So why specifically use references to Greek lore and gods for the story you were telling there?
So one thing I do for the Eldritch realm in the Signal is I like to synthesize a lot of concepts together. So let's just say for the Eldritch realm, by and large, an album about, let's just say, a guy traveling through the afterlife. And if you ask me what either album's about, I might tell you like 3 different things depending on when you ask me. So don't take that with a grain of salt. But so he's traveling through the afterlife or reaching some sort of afterlife. And I was like, okay, Charon, Opalpade, Ferryman to the River Styx, stuff like that. Then at that point in the song, he's essentially stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to say a rock and a hard place in a song that's not super metal or cool or anything like that. So let's say, okay, well, instead of being stuck between a rock and a hard place, he's stuck between Scylla and Charybdis or something. The Argonauts, something had to choose whether or not to get sucked into the whirlpool of Charybdis or face Scylla, the Hydra monster or something like that. So it's my attempt to sort of stay within the bounds of the thematic concept that I'm going for, while also just trying to like have something cool to say. You know what I mean? So that would, because I can't remember if there's any other allusions to Greek. Okay, that's what I wanted to say earlier, is that I think at that point in the when I was writing the Eldritch Realm, I was super into like referential literature or a lot of allusions. So I can't necessarily give you an example of that, but at the time, if I can remember correctly, I was just under the impression that it was really cool to sort of pull from a lot of different types of literature and themes and stuff like that and sort of smash it together. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, well, does that carry through then to the reference to Lilith that I assume is derived from Lilith of the Old Testament? And
so you got it. Yeah, you got it there with Saphariel. I can't really remember how I got onto that topic, but at some point I read about him, and so in this context, Lilith is he was some pseudo. He was like a pseudo astronomer, astrologer guy. I don't think any of his work is necessarily considered good. It's more like it's like what's that guy that Ozzy Osbourne Mr. Crowley or something like that. He's like some sort of like pseudo occultist who like said a lot of cool shit, but it's not factually correct or anything. And don't quote me on that. But so he had the concept of the black moon or the blue moon or something like that, and he called his Lilith. And I just read that, unfortunately, a lot of my stuff is sourced from a lot of random Wikipedia reading. And I sort of just find things that I think are cool and go, okay, weird occult astronomer has concept of black moon called Lilith. That sounds pretty cool. Let me sort of create a character in my story that is, you could argue astronomically focused. Doesn't really have anything to do with the real life person, but I use that as a basis to to sort of make my own story, if that makes sense. So it's sort of just like smashing a lot of concepts together into something that sounds pretty cool, in my opinion. That kind of answer your question there?
Yeah, absolutely. Is there a different impact from like compared to the Greek? And is the reason that you use Greek and like Judeo-Christian mythology? Like, why not I don't know, Chinese or Russian or anywhere? Yeah,
for sure. So I think it's a good question. I unfortunately don't necessarily have a good answer for it, other than, brought up in like, I'm not religious or anything like that, but brought up in a Christian household. I was really into Greek mythology as a kid. Tried to read like every book I could find about it. Super into Hercules when I was the Disney movie Hercules when I was younger.
The first Disney inspired lyric, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, it's more of just, I guess, taking things that I'm interested in. If for argument's sake, I'm not sure I could ever do it authentically or something, but let's just say one album in the future is about, a guy traveling to the east, Son Goku style, well, I guess he went to the west, but whatever, you know what I mean? If I were to do something like that, I would then research Chinese mythology and then implement that into the story. You know what I mean? So it's certainly not, there's no specific reason why I used it other than I thought it was cool. You know what I mean? Unfortunately, yeah. Sorry for anyone that's like looking for deeper meaning and all of it. Yeah, it's sounds cool.
So moving on to the kind of a discussion of more your language choices in your lyrics. One thing that we did notice on the Eldritch Realm was, in comparison to previous release, was that there's a general kind of increase in the amount of rhyme. So I think we counted 7 rhymes on Saturnine, such as unthinkable, diabolical, you sought, you fought, or mortal ties, sudden demise. But many songs have no rhyming at all. But the Eldritch Realm has 7 on the first 2 songs alone, as well as more complex rhyming schemes that we didn't see on the previous album, like ACBA on Shore, Ensured, Form, Abhor, and ABAB on Phylactery, Rebirth, Chimes, Lead Me, This Earth. And there's like 24 rhymes total and no song being rhymeless on that release. And then the Signal from Outer Space is pretty similar with about 7 rhymes on the first song alone. So yeah, what's happening here? What led you to kind of lean into rhyme in your writing?
So just to preface this question by my going, I thought it was I was tickled pink that you guys had counted the rhymes in these songs, because it's something I maybe knew in the back of my head that I was like, okay, I'm rhyming a lot now. But it was very funny for me to read it listed out like that. So that's when I was like, oh my gosh, these guys did their research. So I thought that was very awesome of you guys. I just wanted to preface that because I was talking to my brother about it, and I'm just like, wow, okay, this is pretty cool. And I just, yeah, for sure. And I just want to take a second here to soapbox a little bit, because especially with what you're about to get into, it's sort of thing, talking about conceptual records and what I'm about to mention. It's stuff that I have wanted to talk about for a long time, but no one in my life cares nearly enough to hear about any of it. So it's pretty cool that you guys reach out to me and ask this kind of stuff.
That's in our research.
Yeah, this is absolutely the space for that kind of discussion.
No one wants to hear me dump about this stuff in my real life. So with the rhyming, in music, I think, and especially I try to adhere to this, I think, on the Eldritch Realm, but definitely the Signal, what you're saying in your song has to be at service to the music. So what I mean by that is that there needs to be flow with what you're saying. You don't necessarily have to be rapping, but there's got to be a flow to your lyrics and your speech and what you're singing. So I think when there's no rhyming in music, it just sounds so stilted and awful. there needs to be, like I said, a flow, and I think at some point, maybe in my like early-ish to mid-20s, I got really into a lot of different kinds of rap music where flow is the whole game. So that helped me understand that if it doesn't matter what you're saying has to sound good, if that makes sense. So that's why I could say things like I don't necessarily care about lyrics that much, because I don't always care about the content of your lyrics. I just want what you're saying to sound good when you're saying it. And I'm not saying that I necessarily hit that mark all the time in my music, but the lyrics have to be in service of the music, and your concept is not more important than the song. So the song has got to be good, and then you can sing about what you want to sing about. So I go back to Dream Theater. There are times when I listen to Dream Theater when they say something and I'm just like, oh, geez, you guys could have thought of a cooler thing to say than that, for argument's sake. Or what they say has zero flow and it sort of takes me out of the song, because now all I can think about is how stilted that sounded and how it's no longer doing the song any service. So my increase in rhyming over time is directly related to that, because I want it to flow together. I also, again, not saying I do it every time, but I like to rhyme. I think it helps the flow of the song. And I try to not rhyme. I try not to do the most basic rhyming I can. Again, not saying I always get there, but like I mentioned earlier, not rhyming back with attack, not rhyming, dark with bark. I mean, no one's doing that, but you know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to say things in a way that is interesting and not the most brainless way you can say it. So I'd say that is definitely the core of where the increase in the rhyme scheme came from. I can't really remember what I was thinking about when I was 15 or when we did that EP, Let There Be Light, but it definitely started around the time of the Eldritch Realm and became completely the focus of the Signal. The story didn't matter. What I'm saying didn't matter. It needed to sound good. And then I work on that other. So all my demos for music is just nonsense words, but it's nonsense words that feel like they flow together. And then sometimes the nonsense words stay. I can't remember exactly. Actually, I won't say anything because I don't want people to read their favorite lyric in the album and go like, oh, he actually that's just some nonsense that came out when he was trying to figure out what to sing there. But there is parts of that, and I believe I've read that Tommy Rogers from Between the Buried and Me does something similar, where sometimes parts of his word salad that came out during his demoing of records stays on it because it sounds good. And sometimes I'll sit there and be like, why am I trying to write some cool stuff over this when it sounds good here? And then there was just another point I wanted to make there, but it's kind of escaped me. So my method for writing lyrics is, if anyone were to hear any of my early demos of vocal ideas, it's all nonsense. And then I take that nonsense and try to transcribe it into the story. So there's no real way I can properly demonstrate that, but I'll take the sound of what my word salad was and sort of try and transcribe that to real words. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I sort of help maintain the flow I'm attempting to achieve. But yeah.
Does the word salad have
Good
rhymes
question,
in it,
good
or do you
question.
add them later?
That's a good question. Maybe a little bit. But it's just mostly word salad. Or if, let's just say we're talking about the first verse of word salad might have a word that I like the sound of. So then I make sure that the second line ends with a rhyme for that word that I liked the sound of. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just like get the process of the word salad, is it like you like just like spontaneously just like coming up with stuff like off the dome, like as you're kind of like just doing like draft track vocals and stuff like on top of the song? Is that like how it works?
That's a good question. I'm not sure you can describe in words how that comes out of me, but yeah, I'd say okay, it's a little hard for me to remember if I'm being totally honest, but let's just say any demos that we have knocking around right now, sometimes it's going to sound kind of corny, but sometimes it just comes to you, where I think for the song The Acid Lakes of Ganymede, I was just, and I'm not saying this doesn't necessarily answer your question in terms of the word salad. That is just, I don't know where that comes from. Sometimes on a demo, it'll just start like pouring out of me. Not to say that it makes sense necessarily, but let's just say in a world where one of these new demos we have ever sees the light of day, from the get-go, the song has a distinct feel. And then wherever my vocals are supposed to come in, the word salad that came out of that felt like it matched the tone of the song, or at least how I felt when I listened to it for the first time. So if that song ever comes out, I know what that song is going to be about because my word salad matched what I wanted to do with it, if that makes any sense at all. But then, I guess slightly more broadly, I think when I was trying to write the lyrics for the album, I think for the Eldritch realm and the Signal, I knew what I tend to do is this is going to sound kind of silly, but I think of the title first is the first thing I do. So I knew that I wanted to write, actually that might not be true for the Eldritch realm, but it was true for the Signal. I knew that I wanted to write a big sci-fi concept album, and I have, I don't know if I have them anymore, but I just had like note page after note page in my phone of random ideas I would throw down. And one day I think to myself, and I just to preface some of this as well by saying that I did a lot of research, and for anyone listening, I'm using air quotes there. I listened to a lot of 50s sci-fi radio broadcasts. Okay. It was called X-1. So I listened to all of that. I watched a ton of movies. I read a lot of Wikipedia pages. I say that all to sort of give a little background in the sense that I have a lot of stuff floating around, and I then try to sort of synthesize it all together. So one of those items was I just wrote down one day, the signal heard throughout space. And I thought to myself, and initially the idea of the album, if it's not clear, is I initially started with it wanting to be a 50s sci-fi radio broadcast, and there was going to be some like Ziltoid-esque interstitial monologue-y type stuff, but we threw that out because I find while that stuff might be cool on the first listen, heavily affects subsequent listens. So for argument's sake, in Transitus by Arion, the first time Kenny and I will usually, our bassists get together to listen to new albums when they come out. So there's a really well done voice acting job between each song or every couple of songs on that album. But when I go back and listen to it on my own, I think to myself, oh gosh, not another 45 seconds of monologue before the song I actually wanted to listen to. So all that to say that, so I start with the title, and I know where we're starting and I know where we're ending. And then I fill in all the gaps with all the random stuff that I picked up along the way, if that makes sense. I know I was getting a little tangential there, so I don't know if I answered your question, but that's definitely something I express.
So speaking of signal throughout space on the newest release, in addition to this kind of, the style you used, it is quite distinct in the way that you performed it, in that it involves an interplay of different speakers, and that like there's multiple people talking in each song, and you have multiple characters. And you have more clean vocals than any other album by far. So did either of these factors affect how you approach writing your lyrics? Like, does anything change when you write something that you know will be able to be heard, air quotes again, on the first take, unlike a scream?
The answer is big time. I was freaking out initially, because it was the only album that I've really done any sort of clean singing on. I know there's clean singing in the Eldritch realm, but I wouldn't necessarily consider that real because it's just sort of like bits and pieces. Whereas after the Eldritch realm, we, as I mentioned earlier, we were starting to get into more heavily into progressive music, and I would also consider at this point progressive metal to be my far and away preferred genre. All that to say that things like Arion, which is, big sci-fi, lots of clean singing, multiple characters, played by different vocalists, but don't have that privilege here. So that all led into sort of where the signal ended up, because and then I think the guitarist Ryan and I definitely have a sort of flair for sort of almost musical like, it's going to sound maybe silly, but like musical like whimsy. I tend to like musicals. So that also played a role in what became the signal. But yeah, so initially I was pretty scared because I knew that everyone, I mean, apparently not, because some people asked me for the lyrics, but I knew that people were going to actually hear what I was saying instead of, when I listen to a band like Arcspire, who are famous for very heavy, super quickly spoken metal, harsh vocals. I don't care what he's saying, and I never will, but I like the music. So I say that to emphasize the point that you could never know what I'm saying on the Eldritch realm, and it may not matter to you. But now on the signal, you can hear what I'm saying, and it might matter if it's not good. So that was definitely, I would say, helped me mature potentially as a lyricist, opinion notwithstanding, because I knew that people could hear it now. So it became much more important to me to write lyrics that weren't, cringy is not the right word, but you got to be more careful with what you're saying.
Yeah. And what about the effect of just having different speakers? How is that different, do you think, from a listener point of view, than just, retelling the story from like a third person, narrator perspective?
Yeah, so I guess like I, keep harkening back to, Arion helped me think that multi-character stories were really cool. And I also wanted to expand a little bit from the Eldritch realm, which was essentially, one character the entire time. So I wanted to sort of push myself to go, okay, let's try out a couple different perspectives. It's not spilling over with different characters or anything, but it's just something I wanted to test out. Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Oh, just like, what is the effect having multiple speakers versus just having a single narrator, detailing events from a third person perspective?
Sure, yeah. So definitely also to sort of break up how the story flows. The narrator in the signal doesn't exactly play a huge role. But I definitely, so in the Eldritch realm, for argument's sake, let's just say that there's the main character and Safariel, who is the big bad guy of that album. I wanted there to be a bit more interplay between the two main characters of the album, rather than the bad guy being more conceptual and not like concept album, just like more abstract in nature. I wanted him to be a bit more concrete. So that's sort of where the idea of having more than one voice really came from.
When you were trying to embody these voices, did it affect the words you chose or the way that you wrote the lines, or was that just more on how the song was?
So definitely a little bit. So let's just say I think the bad guy of the signal is called the formulator, and I think he says something the first time on the Acid Lakes of Ganymede, and I definitely sing that line, with elevated emotion, and then he comes back in the next song. I'm blanking here. The Human Molecule, sorry. And his line specifically in that song, I wanted there to be, I'm not saying I did this holistically or when it happens, it's not always because of, but I did want there to be a distinctness to who was talking at the time. Again, not super noticeable on this album. I Am But a Man, but because things like Arion have the privilege of having, 6 vocalists on the album where they can truly be their own characters. And contrasting that with, sorry.
Oh, continue.
Oh, sorry. Contrasting that with Arion's first album, where there's a different singer each song, more or less, but different singers might be playing the same characters that other singers were playing the last song. So I was not into that. So I definitely wanted to try to make a distinct nature to each character. And if we were to ever do an album again with multiple characters, I would probably try much harder to make characters distinct and consistent between songs as best I could.
Well, to return to an earlier point that you raised about, doing research into, is it 50s sci-fi radio broadcasts?
Yeah, specifically X-1.
Yeah, well, I was wondering, is that like the source of a lot of the space terminology that you've incorporated into Signals?
Yeah, big time.
Yeah, because we have things like, for the sake of listeners, like Ultima Thule is a body orbiting Neptune. The spaceship's name, Cygnus 1, references a constellation. The song Acid Lakes of Ganymede refers to the moon of Jupiter. And we believe the closing track, Arecibo?
Arecibo, yeah.
Arecibo, thank you. Calls to the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico. So all of those are just from this broadcast that you referenced?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So again, I want things that I do to feel authentic.
Right.
And for listeners, big air quotes there, big air quotes. But I say that to say that, I don't necessarily think we hit the mark each time for the Eldritch realm specifically, but I see a lot of comments online that say it feels like this album is thematically consistent in that the cover is a 30s horror poster. The content of the lyrics is Lovecraftian in nature. And there are parts of the album that help tie that together. So that makes me feel good when I read that. So the idea behind listening to all those broadcasts and watching the movies and maybe reading a couple books was that I want it to feel authentic. So those terms didn't necessarily originate from like the broadcast, but let's just say I was reading about a lot of different sci-fi concepts, and I then try and synthesize that into a way that doesn't just end up being, I want to find a better word than inauthentic, but, it feels like a sci-fi adventure, not just a template that you punched a couple of sci-fi sounding words into. And I think actually, by the way, I think you guys did a good job there. The concept of Ultima Thule is not the celestial body or anything like that. It's that I think it was the Greeks again. So that's a Greek term, and Ultima Thule was, or Thule, if you want to be technical about it. It just meant beyond. I think it means like beyond north or beyond the end. So, and I think I could be getting this wrong because I, read it at the time and then out in one ear, out the other. But it was the concept that this is the farthest point and then beyond that. So they didn't know what was beyond that. So then I used that to say like that maybe this is where this signal originated from. It was from a point beyond what is known. And I, kudos to you guys for getting Arecibo. That is what that's referencing. So that was the concept of the Arecibo message from that observatory you mentioned. And the idea behind that is that I think in the 70s or something like that, they sent out a payload into space for superficial reasons. I think it was more of a demonstration of technological prowess than an actual attempt to contact aliens or anything like that. But the Arecibo message contained basic information about humanity. So like, I think it had the image of a man and then some symbols that, corresponded to something that they were trying to express. So I took that concept and thought to myself, okay, well, in the story of the signal, at some point, the captain sends a message about his adventures through time and space, hoping that it reaches somebody that will listen to it. So I guess that's sort of maybe a more grounded in reality way of trying to express my attempt to take real like things that I've read about and then turn them into components of my story. So hopefully that's making sense.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah.
Why use real places though, instead of just like, make things up, like make up a name of a spaceship, make up a name of a planet? Because you have made things up in the past.
Sure. Making up stuff is hard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think it's just more interesting personally. You might, most people aren't going to know what Arecibo is or means. But I think it's just more interesting to take that real life concept and then turn it into, maybe distill its meaning and then use it for my own purposes rather than, because if I called that, this is going to sound stupid because I can't think of some cool word off the top of my head, but if I just called that song some sort of gobbledygook, nonsense word, not to say anyone is looking into it hard enough to understand that anyway. You guys did, kudos. But it gives it that sort of, and when I say deeper meaning, I'm not saying that it's profound, but it gives it that sort of additional layer that I find interesting. Cygnus 1, interestingly enough, a lot of people are like, yeah, it's clearly a Rush reference because they've got 2 songs, I think, called Book of Cygnus chapters 1 and 2 or something to that effect. Sorry, not a huge Rush fan if I messed that up. It was actually because another band that I like called Vector has a song called like the Cygnus Terminal, and I just thought like, wow, that sounds super badass. I want to also use Cygnus somewhere on my album as a way to sort of, again, bring together all these sort of different kind of disparate sci-fi concepts.
And I suppose moving forward, with more discussion of the newest album, we wanted to talk about your use of perspective, as we've talked about the different speakers and stuff that appear on this album. But we did see that the newest album also features, a lot of use of I. So a lot of your songs are told from the first-person perspective. But to pair with the Eldritch realm, That album has like 18 and then 2 just from Lilith's speech. And this new one hits 18 eyes before the album was even half over. So why do you reckon you more actively wrote from the first person perspective, like on the new album?
So full disclosure, when I read that, when you counted the eyes on the newest album, it hurt a little bit because I try so hard not to do that. And obviously I'm not successful, but I tend to think, unfortunately, especially for me, I tend to think that it's a huge crutch when writing lyrics or trying to make a story. Obviously, you know, I sort of maybe try and circumvent that by making it a main, like first person main character perspective so that there's a little more reason to, but I actually can't stand that I do that. And I wish I were, better at what I did so that I could sort of work around that. And that would probably be a goal for me if we were to ever make another album, because I find it to be such a lazy crutch when trying to write lyrics. Because you want, it's you know, it's sort of like a different version of my philosophy on swearing in music is that there's so many things and so many ways to say things that I don't want to have to rely on the first person I all the time, but I do. Did that sort of answer your question? It's definitely something that I'm not like a huge fan of in my own writing.
It's interesting you say that. I don't think I've really heard that. I don't think we've, Wes, you can check me on this, but I don't think anyone's like suggested that there is any issue with using I, like from like a writing or a literary standpoint. Like,
yeah, again, it's just one of my you know, personal quirks. It's like, so, you know, I know I keep referencing it because I do truly think it's like an awesome feat of like lyric writing and concept coming forward in metal in a way that most people aren't doing it. But Palimpsest by Protest the Hero, don't quote me on it, but he's certainly not saying I a lot. He's telling stories about, you know, American exceptionalism and stuff in a way that I find really compelling, and it's not all told from different versions of a first person perspective. So that would definitely be, I mean, it can be hard sometimes when you're trying to write a story with like actual characters in it that need to have internal thoughts and potentially interact with other characters. But yeah, it's just, I find it to be a lazy crutch in my own lyric writing. I could probably like, you know, soup it up a little bit, make it a little more abstract and poetic and not use I all the time. But then that also unfortunately conflicts with my other tenet of the story needs to be grounded and followable. So if you dress up your concept in too much fluff, then you're just going to be like, all right, well, I don't understand what's going on here anymore. And I don't like reading passages in concept albums of what is going on now. I've completely lost the plot.
Well, I was going to say that, like, you know, some might say that the like use of I like helps the listener, reader, whomever kind of connect better with the narrator and the story as kind of like a viewpoint from which kind of like understand all the events that occur. Is that not something that you necessarily like see yourself? Like, I mean, even as the writer, like, do you see a greater connection between yourself and the characters that you embody when you do write from the I perspective?
No, not really. I mean, again, I think that's maybe part of what I don't like about it is that I want people to remember that I'm writing a story with characters. Again, some of what on a very high level, some of the things and concepts in the album relate to how I felt when I wrote the lyrics at the time. But I don't want people to read the lyrics and be like, oh, this is actually him speaking through the character right now. You know, just to give a specific example, I think in Suspended Animation, the captain says stuff like, I don't know, like, I'm alone and I hate it here, and I'll never make it on my own and stuff like that. And that I didn't want people to think that that's like me speaking through the character, be like, this is how I feel, like I'm trapped. No, like that's not the case. Again, it's reflective of the thing that I felt about when I was writing it, but it's not, I didn't want it to come off as like a cry for help, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's just a more
And
indirect connection rather than a direct one, right?
Sure. So then,
Okay.
but then using I a lot can muddy that water sometimes, potentially. And then it goes back to the idea of finding interesting ways to express things and constantly going, I feel this way, I am doing this thing, is just not a super interesting way to frame a story around.
It's interesting.
When you're reading Dune or something, Paul's not going like I. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's interesting because this is kind of reminiscent of some of the comments that like Oliver Alleron made when we interviewed him about his lyrics for Archspire. And one of the things that he said, like, to paraphrase, is more or less like, I don't want any of me in my lyrics. I want it to be totally impersonal. I want it to be totally immersive in this world that I've created. Like, I don't want the listeners to be thinking about like me as a person when they, engage with like, my work. Is that basically where you're coming from?
Not entirely. There's a time where I would have said that, probably if you asked me the Eldritch realm, I would have said yes. Because let's just say the Eldritch realm's concept was based very loosely on like, let's just say I was at a point in my life where I felt a little stuck. And then the story of a guy that can't die and is constantly seeking a way to reach a sort of afterlife. I had a vague feeling that I tried to express as a concept for an album, if that makes sense. And then the signal, searching for something, wanting something very badly, feeling like you might lose what you have in an attempt to get to this endpoint. I'm using vague emotional concepts to frame a story around, but it's not super deep, and it's not so it's sort of like, I'd say maybe I fall a little bit in the middle there, where I don't want you to be thinking about that when you're listening to the album, but that's what the album came from, if that makes sense. So like, I would totally agree with him if we were having a discussion about it, be like, I hear you, brother, And I do, I really like Archspire as well. I just was listening to their album at the gym today. So definitely a big fan of those guys.
So while we're on the topic of kind of voicing, one thing that surprised us is the use of rather casual, colloquial, quote unquote, Western speech in an otherwise sci-fi epic, especially for characters you call formulons on one track. You have phrases like Raiden with no G at the end, go till sundown, rev the jets, cuz rather than because, it's gonna be fun, get 'em, over for it's begun instead of before, etc. Why did you switch to this style of language after the use of phrases like distant rumbling, swelling to a crescendo, or cosmic background radiation from the epoch of the combination that sort of featured as the norm in the prior songs?
Sure. So I actually thought this question was super cool. And it's very specific as well. Basically, the formulons, again, I think Contact as a song is a bit more, what's the word? It's more playful in nature. So again, that harkens back to what I was saying about really wanting the lyrics to tonally match the song. Mm-hmm. So, this feels like chest beating. What's the band Lemmy Kilmister's from?
Motorhead.
Motorhead. That's sort of like Motorheady, reckless abandon type stuff. So I wanted to capture that, and in the context of the story, on the album cover, they're swooping in. The formulons are meant to be like alien biker gang kind of stuff. So I wanted to have fun on that song with the lyrics. I wanted it to be silly, and I wanted it to sound more casual because this is supposed to be, you're supposed to be hearing about what an alien biker gang is doing, for argument's sake. So I thought that was really cool that you guys picked up on that, but that's definitely the basis for that. You know, the characters at the time are more casual in nature, so that's where that comes from.
We also felt that these lines had a bit of humor in them, such as couplets like "Now bring out the champagne, raise your glasses, he's dying in pain." But this isn't really unique to the album.
I'm really proud of that one, by the way.
Glad we could flag it then. Glad I could, host it here. But we actually noticed that, like, throughout your discography, there are sort of hints at humor, intentional or not. On the song you have about Avatar, the line "the vacation you never wanted to take" is something I found particularly humorous. Around the otherwise, kind of dark discussion of things like disembodied hands extend from outstretched arms, seeking to smother the truth behind the lies. Do you aim to add a bit of humor to your lyrics overall? And is this something you've struggled with at all? Like, has there ever been any pushback from within yourself or others saying that, like, humor or kind of joking around isn't something that there's space for in metal lyrics of a band that otherwise means to be taken seriously?
So again, another great question. The answer is I like a little bit of cheese here and there. I'm definitely a huge fan of stuff that can be cheesy. I like it when stuff, and if it's not self-evident from the music, I like it when stuff doesn't take itself super seriously. And again, that's what I've sort of been expressing throughout a lot of this interview, in that, I don't necessarily like it when stuff is trying to be super deep. So I tend to, while I'm not trying to always make it come off as comedic. There are definitely times where I like to throw in a line I think is funny. So I remember getting a lot of pushback back in the day for that "vacation you never wanted to take" line. I thought it was hilarious, and I'm like, nope, it's staying in. And then, sorry, what was the example of the lighthearted line in the signal that you...
Raise the champagne, dying in...
Oh, yeah. So I thought that was hilarious. And I thought, obviously this is not the case, but I was like, rhyming champagne and pain is genius tier stuff. I am 100% doing that. I think that's hilarious. Obviously, there's a time and a place for it on the album. I'm not going to make a joke on the song "The Signal" because that song is setting the scene for the album. It's expressing sort of the emotional drive for the captain, et cetera, et cetera. So there's obviously a time and a place for it. And then especially in "Contact," the song, which holistically was meant to be a tongue-in-cheek sort of, I'm going to take this song to sort of get some of this stuff out of my system, get a bit more lighthearted, it's not serious all the way through kind of thing. So I'd say that's definitely where it tends to come from. And I would say that the line, "It's been a goddamn ride" at the end of Arecibo is that same sort of style where I wanted it to feel human, I guess. So you'd think that's maybe what someone might say genuinely if they had just finished something to, obviously not flying through space and stuff, but to maybe be a bit more human in speech rather than the whatever else I'm doing during the album.
I mean, is there ever a limit to this? You said that you put humor in places where it's suited, and kind of leave it out where it's going to kind of detract from the concept behind a given song. In general, though, do you think there's a limit to the use of humor in a genre like metal? Do you is there a danger that you might cross beyond a certain line, you enter into kind of joke lyric territory?
Big time is the answer. So it's Devin Townsend Ziltoid gets close to being too much of a joke, but I think it ends up skirting the line perfectly. The amount of my friends that I can quote that album to and be like, "Make it perfect," or something like that. is
Sorry, like the minute you said
So
it, I know
true.
exactly the exact.
Yeah.
I know exactly, okay.
Yeah.
or like when he drinks the coffee and is like fetid. I mean, it's like, I think that's hilarious. I think just to have an example of a specific album, I think the like stoner God of the Universe gets a little close to like too silly, but again, this was like slightly different time kind of thing. But the answer is totally yes. I would never want the cheesiness that I enjoy to turn something that I helped make into a joke, but I want to get the point across that, like, hey, we're supposed to have fun here, so let's have a little fun. There are a couple of bands that I'm not saying are bad or anything, but I feel like they take themselves way too seriously. And not to say that I don't sometimes want to listen to more seriously oriented music, but it just gets a bit much. Like, I tend to like things that are, bombastic, theatrical, semi self-aware, like, hey guys, when I was younger, I would vehemently not want to watch brainless action movies, because I was like, oh, cinema needs to be, there's got to be something more there. But now, I feel like a lot of the times I just want to watch a dumb action movie because I want to be taken somewhere else and I want to have a good time. So that's sort of what I'm trying to achieve in the vibe I'm trying to put out there in the music. So hopefully that makes sense there.
Do you think that, like, you'd appreciate most things if they had a smattering of humor? Like would you consider yourself, say, maybe if black metal, for instance, popped a few jokes here and there, do you think you'd gravitate to that a little bit more over progressive? Or like, is that a genre that just doesn't work? It's got to be cult,
Okay, so my knee-jerk reaction to that was going to say no, just because it's a very intense style of metal, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So there's not a whole lot of room for that. That being said, I do remember there's a band called, I might be saying this wrong, but Karish Angren, and they've got a song called, they have a song called Bloodstains on the Captain's Log, which is a euphemism. And I think that song is funny. It doesn't come off comedically, but I find it humorous, but not I'm not like laughing at the music or anything, but I think it's funny. So I think if you have a sort of subtle wordplay or something like that, that can be funny, you can fit that into black metal. But I think black metal that is trying to be funny is not funny. I think maybe that's a good way of putting it, is that if you're trying to be funny in music, it's not funny. But if you sort of throw a little elbow jab here and there, it can come off a lot better. One thing I did want to say is that I know that I've seen like a song recently that I thought was really funny. And I'm just trying to think of a good way of phrasing this. So here's the thing, is that this funny metal song I'm talking about, I don't want to say what it is because it's nothing to, I don't want to denigrate people or anything like that, but the song is genuinely funny for about 45 seconds to a minute, and then there's 2 minutes of song left. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's like the humor can't carry the song. At some point, the song needs to be good as well, but the song is just funny. And I think that's sort of what I mean when I say things earlier, like the lyrics and concept all needs to be in service of the song. You need to have a good song, and then the song can be funny. But not all funny songs are good. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, like, yes, looping to that, you mentioned not trying to be funny. I guess because I would kind of argue that Ziltoid tries to be funny. Does that suffice because the songs are good enough?
I would say so. And again, like I said, I find some bits of Ziltoid to be a bit much.
Oh, yeah.
But when I say bit much, I mean like I don't find the concept of like the all-knowing stoner god to be that funny. But I think Ziltoid drinking the coffee and spitting out in the beginning is funny. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's like, you don't want to overdo it obviously Ziltoid, this special place in my heart, stuff like that. So it's hard to take that, not at face value, but it's hard to use that as a reference point because I love that album. So, but it's like I loved Weird Al Yankovic when I was a kid.
Oh yeah.
Am I gonna go back and listen to it again? Probably not. I'm not trying to look for just like funny covers of songs that are good. But I loved it when I was 10. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, we might jump we have basically two kind of big questions, and I think the one we're going to ask you after this makes more sense here. So we've talked to some bands that do sci-fi stuff on the podcast, like Hybrid Nightmares and Archspire, and we've been mentioning Ziltoid. There's 2 Ziltoid albums, and you're clearly familiar with all this. You've listened to these bands. When you were sitting down to write your own sci-fi epic, were these in the back of your head? Like, did you worry about comparisons to release an album, people say like, oh, it's like a Ziltoid kind of thing? And if so, did you make efforts to differentiate yourself from all the stuff that's out there before?
So that's another good question. So the answer is that there is a degree of reference you want people to notice, or at least in our music. Not always, but sometimes you do. We're unfortunately, maybe not unfortunately, but we're one of those bands where people tend to say, well, the nice people tend to say things like they are a band that clearly you can tell who they're taking influence from, but they manage to take that and make it their own. So that's obviously the nicest interpretation of that. The one I tend to, I'll agree with that one. So, and then, so for this album, we were definitely listening to a lot. Obviously, we were listening to a lot of Dream Theater when we made it. So I wanted people to compare us to Dream Theater because I'm like, people are comparing our band to Dream Theater, like goal achieved. I think we also get heavily compared to Between the Buried and Me. Nothing wrong with that. I love Between the Buried and Me personally, and so do a couple of the other members of the band. But I think we did that on the Eldritch realm, and I think one of the goals of this album was to be less compared to Between the Buried and Me than we had previously, which was not the case. But I wanted people to see that we were listening to bands like Haken, Devin Townsend, Rush, Dream Theater. Obviously, still a lot of Between the Buried and Me comparisons. Sorry, can you repeat the question? Because I think I had something else that I want.
Did you worry about? Did you do things to make sure that the album kind of avoided that sort of comparison?
So, I mean, the answer is yes. I can only do so much because I think we tend to write slightly compartmentally. Ryan, the guitarist, writes a lion's share of all the music, guitars anyway. He'll obviously ask us for our opinions on what he's doing, but he writes a lion's share of it. So I say that to say that there's an amount of influence that he brings into his portion of the music that I can't control. Same with Kenny in the bass, same with me on the vocals. So obviously I'm not going to pretend like I wasn't heavily influenced by a couple of the earlier bands that I mentioned. Obviously, I would like to think that I'm doing it in a way that is, sort of like the way I approach writing concept albums. It's a synthesis of the things that I like. You can point at things in the Signals lyrics and be like, Arecibo Observatory, Ultima Thule, blah, blah, blah. You can, I'm not trying to hide the fact that I'm interested in or influenced by certain things. But I would like to think that it comes together in a way that is slightly more organic and not just coming off like we're we clearly listen to too much of this band. For argument's sake, there are bands that you listen to and you go, you have been listening to Opeth far too much for far too long, for argument's sake, because they're just so similar. We're trying so hard to ape that style. And again, I'm sure people are saying some people are saying that about the newest record, but you try your best to synthesize and then output. I mean, it's like writing a academic paper, right? You are reading other people's work, synthesizing it, and then using that to make some sort of different, greater point. So,
more broadly,
definitely.
why do you think so many bands in metal, a genre which is, you know, often recognized fairly unfairly for quintessentially quote unquote brutal themes, why do you think so many sci-fi and space bands have been emerging as focal points? Themes have been emerging as focal points for lyricists in this genre.
Yeah, I mean, short answer is, you know, it's cool shit to talk about. You know what I mean? It's, you know, obviously I'm a huge sci-fi guy. You know, I joke to people whenever I watch a movie that is like a world-bound, realistic drama that I enjoyed. It's not that I don't enjoy drama movies, but I'll always choose a sci-fi thriller over a real-world drama every single time. So it's just, personally, it's just what I'm really into. It's easily my preferred genre. And again, I think it maybe leads back to the idea that metal tends to gravitate towards grandiose topics, and then the perfect setting for a grandiose topic is outer space. You know what I mean? So it's all. I feel like I was thinking about this the other day, but that thought is unfortunately gone. But yeah, just the idea. It's like so one thing I find interesting that is related to your point is that I really like surf rock a lot. And there are a couple of themes in surf rock that are sort of related to metal. So like most bands, I you know, this is not factual by any degree, but just from what I experience listening to a good amount, surf rock is either space themed, horror themed, or like obviously beach themed. And I just think to myself, it's interesting that just, you know, similarly to metal, surf rock gravitated towards two concepts where you don't immediately go, yeah, that makes surf rock should be themed like a horror movie. That makes sense, right? You just like, if you say so. So I think these are sort of just universal because they're heavily thematic. So I think it lends itself to any sort of band or type of music that wants to emulate that. So that's I think that's probably what I would say about that.
Well, kind of looking at the language that you've used to write lyrics across all of your releases now, it seems that although there is, of course, some variation in the terminology that you use to write distinct songs off the different releases, as we've discussed, the language in general that surrounds, like, you know, particular terms appears mostly accessible, or at least kind of recognizable to the majority of English language users. So to give some examples, lines like use the weapons of destruction, I no longer wish to play this game, kill every last one of them, xenocide, this is no simulation, contain the word xenocide, which is obviously drawn from Ender's Game, but are otherwise populated by pretty recognizable vocabulary. Similarly, lines like wading through the cold waters of this lifeless shore, obol paid, passage ensured, Sharon's eyes linger on my form, eternal life is something to abhor. Mention obol, which is a form of ancient Greek currency, but again, is surrounded by relatively familiar expressions. And then breathing shallowly, oxygen stores now depleting, Cygnus 1 took quite a beating, harm sustained from overheating, burned away what was remaining. Have some scientific and space-related terminology, but are otherwise not too difficult to pass. So was it your intention to create this balance of the familiar and unfamiliar, you know, using vocabulary drawn from specific sources combined with, you know, relatively like everyday language, or maybe not everyday language, but familiar language?
Yeah, so I would say that that's sort of my attempt to, again, I'm not attempting to create deeply meaningful music, but I want it to come off as like someone intelligent wrote it. So, and by that I mean I want it to to sort of make allusions to things. I want it to read well. Like when I read my lyrics without the context of the song, I want it to sound cool as well. You know what I mean? I don't want it to just sound cool when you're listening to it. I want it to, if you read it without the music and still think, the things said and the way they are said still comes off as cool sometimes. That's kind of the goal. So I would say the things you brought up there are sort of in service of that, where you want it to be, you're like, ooh, let me sprinkle a reference in here, or make sure that the what is happening in the song at the time is clear, but not so clear that you're just listing off a bunch of things that are happening at once, for argument's sake.
And did the language style that appears in the text or like sources that inspired some of these songs, like Lovecraft's writing, for instance, influence the way that you wrote these songs?
I would say the Eldritch realm was probably more of that, and not necessarily his writing, but obviously it's heavily, at the time, if it weren't obvious, but I was super into Lovecraft. But part of the issue I found with some of his stuff is that it's not actually that much fun to read, but the concepts. I mean, sorry, don't want to come off like I'm dragging my knuckles across the floor.
We can drag Lovecraft all you want.
Yeah, I think we're good on that. Yeah,
he's not a good person, I've read everything he's written. I think I read a thing called The Complete, and I would agree with you. Like some of them, like when he nails it out of the park, it's out of the park. But some of his stories, like the idea is good, but the story is
the execution's a bit off.
There's a reason. There's a reason that some of the stories aren't well known.
Exactly. So I think, so you kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's that conceptually, a lot of what he writes about is so freaking cool. But when you read it, you're like, this is not fun to read. It's sort of not necessarily the same, but I remember I'm also a pretty big Sherlock Holmes fan. So when I was going into full Sherlock Holmes binge mode, I realized that there were some Sherlock Holmes stories that just ended on a cold case. And the first time I ever did that, I was like, what? What do you mean he got away? Where's the second half of this story? And that I'm not 100%, to be honest, how related that was to what you were saying, but I just thought about that. And it's something that's bothered me for a really long time. But to get back to
kind of good space to get that out. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, so his, I wouldn't say his literal writing influenced it, but obviously the concept that he created were super influential to what I was writing about in the Eldritch realm. And I think similarly with The Signal, I tried to use, Philip K. Dick stories, and all the radio broadcasts I listened to and stuff like that. I wouldn't say that it influenced my lyrics or the way I wrote my lyrics, but it influenced the lyrics, if that makes sense. Like I'm not trying to like mimic their writing style or anything like that. I mean, people might bring up examples of me doing precisely that, but that's not the goal.
So, well, to tie all this together, like, what would you say the goal of your lyrics is in your music? And what is the purpose or role of lyrics in Parius's music? And more broadly, what is the goal or purpose of lyrics in the extreme metal genre itself?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, again, I think the lyrics that I write are meant to be a reflection of how I felt at the time, but ultimately it's supposed to be a fun listening experience, is in that I want to create a story with enough connecting threads and a concept that can carry the album in a way that is enjoyable to people. I'd say, again, as I've been saying, not trying to make a super deep, huge point, really just trying to create a fun time for a listener to get through. When I listen to something like Metropolis 2 or Scenes from a Memory by Dream Theater, it's just a fun album to listen to, and that's sort of the vibe I think we were trying to really recreate there. In terms of metal as a whole, it's hard to say. It's so, not to give like some sort of cop-out answer, but it's like, for me, some people, you might assume that because I write lyrics and I take my lyric writing seriously, you might think like he cares about other people's lyrics. Like, I don't care about your lyrics. I don't necessarily listen to music to see what anyone has to say, or again, I'm speaking generally. Obviously, if music connects with me, I might check out the lyrics. And I think Opeth's most recent album, In Cauda Venenum, one interesting, again, so sorry, slight tangent here, but that album released as both, is it Swedish? Hopefully it's Swedish, in both Swedish and English albums, due to pressure from the label, because he wanted to do a Swedish album, but due to pressure from the label, he had to release an English version of it as well. And one thing I found really interesting about that is that if you translate his Swedish lyrics into English, I don't know if that's a product of like Google Translate. Sorry, I don't know how to speak Swedish. They are much more on the nose than his English lyrics, presumably transcribed from his Swedish, which would have been written first. So I don't know if that layer of abstraction is not there because of the Google Translate tool that I was using. But I thought it was interesting that his lyrics on the English version are so much more mysterious and cool. So then, again, I'm slightly contradicting myself here, but when I said I don't like lyrics with a bunch of obfuscated meaning, that being said, I do enjoy it in some of Opeth's music and music generally. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's hard to say what the role of lyrics are in extreme metal. As I'm sure both of you guys have heard before from people or your parents or anybody, is that, what are they even saying? I can't understand it. And you just like, I don't know. Sometimes it's not about what you're saying. It's about what it made you feel like. I'm not listening to a Slipknot song going like, ooh, sorry, I missed that third word of the fourth verse. I'm just like, this is making my blood pump. And what I can hear is pleasing to me. So I'd say, different strokes for different folks. But hard to pinpoint the purpose of lyrics in extreme metal holistically, but people have found a way. So hopefully that's profound enough to end on.
For sure.
Absolutely.
So how can people find their way to your music?
Sure. So I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure that we're streaming everywhere that music can be streamed. We got a YouTube channel, a Facebook and Instagram, no Twitter, but we're also, you can find us. This was actually the first time that we were signed by a label in the form of Willowtip Records. So you could find it on their website as well, or probably talking about on any of their social medias. But yeah, thank you guys very much for having me. It was very cool to, as I mentioned earlier, it's very cool to get to intimately discuss a topic that most people did not want to hear me talk about. Just a funny tidbit there. I think actually one of my friends at a party recently made like a half joke about the song Arecibo and like, what does that even mean? and halfway through trying to explain to them, oh, well, actually, it's an observer, blah, 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 blah. You know what I said earlier? They just like, boop, completely checked out and stopped listening. And I was like, why'd you even ask if you didn't care? But so it's nice.
Just an observatory, bro. It's just
yeah, exactly. It's very nice that that you guys have created a platform for me to be able to talk about stuff like this. It's very interesting.
Oh, glad you enjoyed it. I guess
Absolutely.
We don't usually do this, but I guess since we have you, I gotta, so reading the entire album, I just want to know if I got the story right, because we don't usually have like, is this the meaning? But is it like The Ring, like the album we're listening to, is that the signal, and then that's what we hear and we explore it, and then it gets sent back to another listener? Is it like a constant loop?
So pretty close. Again, if you tried to pin me down on almost any part of the album, I might tell you two different things at two different times. But the intro song is called Space Log 0245, and the very end of the album, he is sending out his distress signal with using his space log number 0245. So what I was attempting to do there was that the signal he sends out at the end is so not to over explain, but the first song, Space Log 0245, is meant to be a sort of overture in the style of like Overture 1928 for Scenes from a Memory by Dream Theater, in that it's supposed to have bits and pieces of all the songs in that song. So it's got most of the songs in there, maybe not every single one, or if it is, it might be in differently abstract ways. But the intention there was that the signal he sends out at the end of the album is that first song. So you hear that first song, and it's bits and pieces of each song of the album, like the Arecibo message, if that makes sense. So you basically got it there.
Okay, and then we had, all right, cool, nice. Again, I did the bachelor's degree in English, paying off.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you definitely don't need a bachelor's degree in English to understand what I'm trying to say, but it definitely helps.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, man. It's been great.
Absolutely, guys. It was very interesting and nice to be here. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you for listening to Lingua Italica. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stay tuned for our next episode. Before we leave, we just wanted to acknowledge that this podcast is recorded on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay respects to their elders, past and present.